I think the philosophical tradition has been, and the main concepts like virtue and soul and self have come through and been Christianized and made incredibly transcendent and otherworldly. And so it's hard to get people to think those concepts differently when they've been ingrained in our mind for so long. But through some of the math and physics, there might be better conceptions for us.
And that's sort of a good idea. The way I would respond to that is that the word philosophy is a kind of a special word for me. You know, that it's not sociology. Like sociology is really good and anthropology, but philosophy is giving something an award, you know. It's respecting it. It's saying there's a profundity to this. And so we can look and we can say that there are resources in other departments, but if we look at our own tradition, in the 19th century, logic and theology was taught in the same program at Oxford and Cambridge. That in America, the philosopher at a college was usually also in charge of the Christian club. That theology or that philosophy was largely theologically driven. Johns Hopkins, you know, was a breakthrough where science and Harvard, you know, with William James and so on. But the idea that I think you're right in suggesting that we have to find the resources to understand this tradition in different places in our academy. But I don't think that would excuse us from giving Chinese philosophy the mantle of philosophy. That it really does have an ethic, you know, that is distinctly its own. It's sui generis. It is a Confucian ethic. That Confucianism's encounter with the Western tradition is not its defining moment. That it has its own identity. And so for us to reshape our discipline in such a way that we can accommodate, and we're doing that all the time, you know. I mean, we've kicked Emerson out of philosophy. I think the philosophy department at Harvard is housed in Emerson Hall, and Emerson, no philosopher is going to say that Emerson is a philosopher. I will say Emerson's a philosopher, but you'll go a long way before you'll find another person. So what I would do is I would say we need, in order to accommodate it, philosophy has to get bigger. But I wouldn't say philosophy can remain the same, and if we're going to talk about Chinese philosophy, let's go to the physics department.
I didn't mean to say that it's less than philosophy, it's philosophy plus. There are philosophy become less, and so we don't have resources just within philosophy to accommodate it. There wasn't to put Chinese philosophy not to give that mantle. Say it's philosophy plus all these other concepts.
Yeah. When we endorse philosophy, like I think as philosophers, we not only study these traditions, but at the end of the day, we have to endorse. We have to say, you know, is this worth, you know, we recommend to people that they live, you know, in a certain way. That's our responsibility too. And so I think that really requires that that we pay attention to the and we understand that one of the reasons for endorsing a philosophy is that it's consistent with other dimensions of our academy, that it's consistent with knowledge, that it's consistent with science. And when you think about relationality, the primacy of relationality, another way for talking about that is ecology. Another way of talking about that is interdependence. When we break the world, we don't lose individual things, we lose ecologies. You know, and so we have to, for the planet, for ourselves, I think we need a gestalt shift, and that is that we have to start thinking relationally. One of the great crimes of human beings is taking each other for granted. You know, we don't pay attention to the roles and the relationships. Go home and call your mother.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up, you brought up the book, but they retranslated the book back in Chinese. What do you want to comment on that? Previous conversation brought that back to my mind.
It's because I know so much more about the Chinese tradition than the Chinese themselves. In Chinese, they have an expression. They say, "Bu jian lu shan jian mian mu, zhi yuan jian zai zi xian zhong." You know, that I can't see the true face of Mount Bu because I'm standing on top of it. That when you're looking at another tradition, when you're looking at another person, that we need to have both an internal understanding and an external understanding, sort of a genetic and a morphological kind of understanding. And so there's a sense in which, I was saying this today, that we don't say that Beethoven is music that German people like to listen to, you know. You can't have New Year's in Japan without Beethoven's Ninth. I mean, it is the theme song of Japan's New Year's. That Beethoven belongs to the world. And when Beethoven is embraced by Chinese people, Beethoven gets bigger, you know. It becomes world culture. And so the same kind of thing with this, this Confucian culture is that Chinese scholars, the one thing I've never had within the Chinese world is condescension. Like, I don't find Chinese scholars saying, Lao Wai, you know, he doesn't really understand. I see it in a different way, and they find that interesting because it appreciates it. Not simply in the sense of being responsive to the magnitude of it, but appreciating it in terms of value, making it more valuable. We're having in Honolulu in October, we're having the inaugural meeting of something called the World Consortium for Research in Confucian Cultures. And Vietnam is coming, and Korea is coming, and China is coming, and Japan is coming. And the idea is that we have to stop treating that part of the world as Chinatown, as something that does its own thing and that doesn't have relevance to the world. It's not the answer to the world's problems, but at this point in time, when individualism won't give us, when single actors can't solve the world's problems, what we need to start thinking relationally. And I mean, my own life, speaking again from the heart, I have a series at Peking University Press that has translated 9 of the most important secondary works of John Dewey. In Shanghai, they're translating the 37 volumes of John Dewey. My idea is that if America and China can find an appropriate relationship, that the strongest, most powerful, biggest economy in the world, and the fastest rising, most populous country in the world, if these two worlds can find an appropriate relationship, then the North Koreas and the Irans and the other kinds of problems that we face, we can deal with those. But if these two worlds, America and China, don't get it together, the 21st century remains precarious, you know. And so that's me. Like, I think that there are huge resonances between American pragmatism and Confucian philosophy. And Terry, you know, we've talked about that. You know, that Dewey has got a relational conception of person. George Herbert Mead. I mean, there's so many things that go on. Very different too. China, family-centered. You know, family doesn't play a role in you know, a little bit in Aristotle, a little bit in Hegel. You know, but family is not a model for social organization in the Western tradition. And China's huge. All relationships in the Chinese world are family. You know, that's the way you don't talk about human beings. You talk about renjia, human family. You don't talk about country, guo. You talk about guojia, country family. You know, you don't talk about philosophers, jie. You talk about jie, the philosophical family. Or that might be stretching a little bit. But yeah, so that gave me a chance. I mean, it's not because it's better, it's because it's different. And what they do also is they leave the English translation of the text in the text, because Chinese scholars now have a standard of English that where now they use it as a commentary. You know, like, of course you have the classical language, then you have the Putonghua, the Baihua kind of a translation in a standard text. The English is one more level of you know, sort of a commentary.
I really enjoyed your talk. Can I ask you, I know this is a philosophy talk, but I'd like to ask you a historical question. That is, when I'm a historian teaching at the UA, and when I was in graduate school, I read one textbook written by Professor Aishao and Fairbanks on Asian history. And they said although the traditional Chinese culture was looks like very much Confucian, but underneath that the Confucian facade, or behind this Confucian facade, is the legalistic culture. That was really the driving force of the Chinese society and Chinese culture. And it really struck me for many years. And how would you respond to that particular phrase?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great big question, and it's an important one. Fairbank is famous. At Harvard, you have the Fairbank Center, of course. And Fairbank was famous in his career for impulse response. That China, Hegelian interpretation of China was the country without spirit, without Geist. That history began in China, but of course it ended up in Germany. Rather. And so if China doesn't have any Geist, any spirit, then China only moves by impact from outside. And so this way of thinking about China is though China is kind of a dead culture, an old culture, a culture without life. It was prevalent in the first part of the 20th century among Western historians, and Fairbank was the leader. He was the teacher of those. And later Fairbank came to think a little bit differently as he grew older. But then along came Paul Cohen, with his Discovering History in China, where he said that Fairbank has got it wrong. I think Cohen was even a student of Fairbank, but that Cohen has got it, or that Fairbank has got it wrong. That we have to understand the dynamic within China. The Chinese culture is changing according to its own rhythm, to its own. We wrote a book in the 90s called The Democracy of the Democracy of the Dead, Dewey, Confucius, and the Hope for Democracy in China, where we wanted to talk about Easternization. That in a relationship, change goes in both directions. That the West, when you think of the car industry in America, when you think of Brecht or Benjamin Britten, music, no drama, when you think of popular American cuisine and all of the different Asian foods that we eat, when you think of warfare, after Vietnam, my translation of The Art of Warfare did very well. That the relationship goes in both directions, and it's alive and it's well. And so Fairbank, I think, and Reischauer, were ways of thinking about China that lived in its own place. And the reason why I would dispute, the idea of law as opposed to li, ritual, or what we call, roles and relationships, is the fact that Confucianism as a term originates with John Francis Davis in 1836, second governor of Hong Kong, in a publication called The Chinese Empire and Its Inhabitants. That the Chinese, you don't say Confucianism in Chinese, you say Ru Xue. Ru are us. Ru are the intellectuals in a community who are going to take responsibility for that community. They're going to be the people who say culture is really important. I'm going to embrace that culture. I'm going to understand that culture. I'm going to use that culture to address the pressing issues of the day. And then I'm going to pass that culture on to the next generation with my recommendation that they continue to do this. So Ru, in every generation, are the people, sometimes very conservative, sometimes in a Buddhistic direction, sometimes in a Taoist direction, sometimes in terms of the classics and so on. But every generation has to reauthorize the tradition. 60 generations of Ru before Confucius, 80 generations after Confucius. So I don't see Confucianism as being a potted ideology. I mean, what Davis was doing is he was drawing an analogy with Christianity that is centered on the life of Christ, or Platonism that is centered on the life of Plato. But the Ru are a social class. And the Ru actually, like if you look at the cognate characters, it means the mild people, the gentle people, the gentry, the gentlefolk, who are responsible for the cultural transmission from generation to generation.
Well, sadly, all good things must come to an end, and tonight we have to stop. So let's thank Professor Ames. And I'll come up here so I don't drop things. For those of you who are wishing you knew more about the Analects or would like to read about Confucian role ethics firsthand, actually there are only a few copies, but there are copies at the back of the room that you could buy. And Professor Ames very kindly said he'd be happy to sign them. We have other invitations if you would like to hear more. The conference does conclude tomorrow, but we will be discussing Confucian role ethics. We'll be in the Arts Building. That's a change. So the Arts Building, room 150, the recital hall, and it's open to everyone. You are more than welcome. And finally, as you're going out tonight, you may notice some posters and a happy thing that happened with this conference. Some teachers in the Anchorage School District heard about it and told us about their students who were studying philosophy. So there was a lovely exchange between the UAA Philosophy Department and Gruning Middle School, and the students loaned us their posters tonight as decoration. So you're welcome to look there. There are also pamphlets about studying world philosophies and religions at UAA, and also about this new Ethics Center. So we thank you all for coming. We wish you a glorious evening and very good relationships.
It was great. So they wanted us to not drop the mic. So what do I do?